Over Germany, March 1944, Staff Sergeant Benjamin Warner looked through the plexiglass of his ball turret and saw something that would make the Luftwaffe rewrite their tactical manual. 9 Messerschmitt fighters were descending in a textbook formation, confident and precise, preparing to tear apart the struggling B-17 he was sworn to protect. Warner had exactly one option that defied every rule in the gunnery handbook. He pressed both triggers and held them down. 12 seconds later, all 9 German fighters were falling from the sky, and Warner's gun barrels were glowing white-hot. The incident report that reached German High Command was dismissed as impossible. American propaganda, a statistical anomaly that couldn't exist in the real world. But the gun camera footage told a different story. So did the wreckage scattered across 30 miles of German countryside. This is the account of what actually happened when one man decided that survival meant breaking every rule they'd taught him. Benjamin Warner grew up in rural Pennsylvania, where his father ran a small machine shop that serviced farm equipment. By age 12, Warner could field strip and reassemble almost any mechanical device blindfolded. His hands understood the language of springs, gears, and tolerances before he understood algebra. That mechanical intuition would save his life and the lives of his crew in ways no one could have predicted. When he enlisted in January 1943, the Army Air Corps recruiters saw his test scores and funneled him directly into gunnery school. They needed men who could think in 3 dimensions while under fire, men who could calculate deflection angles while their plane was being torn apart around them. Warner turned out to be exceptionally good at it. What made him different wasn't just accuracy, it was his ability to see patterns in chaos. While other gunners focused on individual targets, Warner saw the entire battle space. He understood how enemy fighters coordinated their attacks, where they were vulnerable, and most importantly, when the rulebook needed to be thrown away entirely. By March 1944, Warner had completed 17 missions over occupied Europe. He'd seen friends die in ways that still woke him up at night. He'd watched B-17s disintegrate in mid-air, their crews tumbling through freezing sky with no parachutes because the explosion had been too sudden. He'd learned that survival often came down to split-second decisions made with incomplete information. The morning of March 18th started like most mission days. Breakfast at 0400 hours, briefing at 0500, with officers pointing at maps showing their target deep in Germany. A ball-bearing factory near Stuttgart, critical war production. Heavy defenses expected. Warner remembered thinking the phrase, heavy defenses expected, had become meaningless. Every mission had heavy defenses. Every mission pushed the odds further against them. Their B-17, designated Lucky Strike by its original crew, had already survived 23 missions. The aircraft bore scars from flak and fighter attacks, patches upon patches holding her together. The crew chief had a saying, "She's held together by rivets, prayers, and sheer stubbornness." That morning, stubbornness would need to be enough. The formation crossed the French coast at 23,000 feet. Warner settled into the ball turret, that cramped sphere of steel and plexiglass suspended beneath the bomber's belly. Most men hated the ball turret. The isolation, the vulnerability, the knowledge that if the landing gear malfunctioned, you'd be crushed on touchdown. Warner found a strange peace in it. Down here, he had the clearest view of the battle. He could see threats before anyone else. That visibility had saved Lucky Strike more than once. The first fighter attacks came near the German border, Focke-Wulf 190s making slashing passes through the formation, their cannon fire walking lines of destruction across the bomber stream. Warner tracked them through his turret, calling out positions to the rest of the crew, but holding his fire. Ammunition was finite. Every burst had to count. The doctrine was clear. Short, controlled bursts. 3 to 5 seconds maximum. Any longer and you'd burn out your barrels or jam your gun. Warner had memorized those rules. He'd also learned that rules written in training manuals sometimes got men killed in actual combat. They were 40 minutes from the target when Lucky Strike took its first serious hit. Flak shell exploded close enough to pepper the right wing with shrapnel. The number 3 engine began trailing smoke, then seized up completely. The pilot, Lieutenant James Corrigan, feathered the prop and adjusted trim. They could continue on 3 engines, but they'd be slower, more vulnerable. The formation was beginning to stretch out as damaged aircraft fell behind. That's when the Messerschmitts arrived. Warner saw them first, small specks in the distance that his trained eye recognized immediately. Not a small patrol, a full squadron, maybe more, positioning themselves for a coordinated attack. He keyed his intercom. "Bandits, 6 o'clock low, estimate 20 plus." Corrigan's voice came back steady despite the situation. "Copy that, Warner. Everyone stay sharp." The German fighters split into groups, a tactic Warner had seen before. Some would attack from the front, forcing the bombers to maneuver, while others hit from below and behind where the defensive fire was weakest. It was effective, because it divided the gunner's attention. You couldn't cover every angle simultaneously. The first wave came in fast. Warner tracked a Messerschmitt through his turret, led it perfectly, and fired a 3-second burst. Tracers reached out across the sky. The German fighter rolled hard left, broke off its attack. Whether he'd scored hits or just forced the pilot to evade, Warner couldn't tell. Didn't matter. The goal was to disrupt their attack runs, make them cautious. A cautious fighter pilot was less effective. The engagement intensified. The air around Lucky Strike filled with tracers, both outgoing and incoming. Warner could hear the waist gunners firing above him, their .50 calibers hammering away, could hear the top turret rotating, engaging targets to the front. The plane shuddered as cannon rounds struck the fuselage. Somewhere behind him, someone was screaming on the intercom. Then the screaming stopped abruptly. Warner forced himself to focus on his sector. He couldn't help whoever had been hit. His job was to keep fighters off their tail, keep them alive long enough to reach the target and get home. That's when Lucky Strike took the hit that changed everything. A cannon shell penetrated the bomb bay, detonating near the hydraulic systems. Warning lights flooded the cockpit. Corrigan's voice came over the intercom, tight with controlled urgency. "We've lost hydraulics. I can't hold altitude. We're falling out of formation." In bomber combat, falling out of formation was a death sentence. The Luftwaffe trained their pilots to identify and isolate struggling aircraft. A lone bomber was easy prey, unable to benefit from the combined defensive fire of the formation. Warner watched through his turret as Lucky Strike dropped away from protective umbrella of the bombers. Above them, the formation continued toward the target, unable to slow down or break formation to help. They were alone. Just one crippled B-17 over hostile territory, with a sky full of German fighters who'd just been handed an easy kill. The Messerschmitts sensed the opportunity immediately. 9 fighters peeled away from the main engagement, forming up for a coordinated attack on the struggling bomber. Warner watched them organize with a sick feeling in his stomach. These weren't inexperienced pilots. The formation was too precise, too professional, probably a veteran squadron with multiple kills already today. They were positioning for a classic stern attack, coming in from directly behind where they could fire into the bomber's length while presenting minimal target profile. Standard doctrine called for the ball turret gunner to engage targets in this scenario with controlled bursts, forcing them to evade, buying time for the pilot to dive or maneuver. But Warner could see that wouldn't work this time. There were too many of them, too well coordinated. Short bursts would scatter them temporarily, but they'd reform and complete their attack. Lucky Strike was too damaged to evade effectively. Corrigan was fighting just to keep the plane flying level. Warner made a decision that every instructor had told him would get him killed. He rotated his turret to face the incoming fighters, checked his ammunition counter, and waited. The Messerschmitts began their attack run in a staggered line formation, each pilot positioned to follow the one ahead through the target zone. It maximized their time on target while minimizing their exposure to defensive fire. Beautiful tactics, exactly what the Luftwaffe manual prescribed. Warner let them close. 1,500 yards, 1,200. His thumbs rested on the firing buttons. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat. Everything else faded away. The fear, the noise, the knowledge that this might be his last action. All that existed was the geometry of the attack, the closing distance, the narrow window of opportunity that was about to open. 1,000 yards. The lead Messerschmitt opened fire, testing the range. Cannon rounds passed over Lucky Strike, glowing tracers marking their path. The other fighters were strung out behind him in perfect interval. Warner pressed both triggers and held them down. The twin .50 caliber machine guns roared to life, hammering out rounds at a combined rate of 1,300 per minute. The turret vibrated violently. Shell casings poured out of the ejection chutes. Warner fought to keep the guns on target as the recoil tried to throw off his aim. Every training exercise, every manual, every experienced gunner would have told him this was insane. Long bursts caused overheating. Overheating caused jams or catastrophic barrel failure. Either would leave him defenseless with 9 enemy fighters bearing down. But Warner had calculated odds that the instructors never considered. He'd realized something during his previous missions while watching fighter attacks. The Luftwaffe relied on discipline and coordination. Their strength came from pilots trusting each other to execute the plan. That trust created a vulnerability. If the lead fighter went down hard enough, fast enough, the pilots behind him would break formation instinctively. Self-preservation would override training. The stream of .50 caliber rounds reached out across the narrowing gap. Warner didn't aim at the lead fighter. He aimed at the point in space where the lead fighter would be in 2 seconds. Deflection shooting at its most demanding. The geometry had to be perfect. At this range, with the fighters coming almost straight at him, there was minimal room for error. His tracers found the Messerschmitt just as it began to fire. The effect was catastrophic. .50 caliber rounds tore through the fighter's engine cowling, into the cockpit, through the fuel tanks. The aircraft didn't just take damage, it disintegrated. One moment it was a sleek fighter diving toward its prey. The next it was expanding debris and flame. The explosion was violent enough that the second fighter flew directly into the fireball. Warner's guns never stopped firing. The continuous stream of rounds was now tracking toward the second Messerschmitt, even as the first one was still coming apart. The second pilot had a fraction of a second to react, not enough time to evade. The fighter caught rounds in the wing root and rolled inverted, trailing fire. The remaining 7 fighters were now flying directly into a continuous stream of heavy machine gun fire. Warner kept both triggers pressed down. The guns were screaming now, overheating rapidly, but still functioning, still firing. The third fighter tried to brake left. Too late. Rounds walked across its fuselage, severing control cable. The aircraft began an uncontrolled roll, falling away from the fourth fighter, fifth fighter. Warner's world had narrowed to pure target tracking. His hands made micro-adjustments to keep the stream of fire aligned with the incoming fighters. Part of his mind was aware that this couldn't possibly be working. 9 enemy fighters should have torn Lucky Strike apart by now. But the lead fighters disintegrating had created chaos in the formation. The trailing pilots were flying into a meat grinder, and their training was screaming at them to break off. Some tried to evade, some froze. All of them flew into Warner's field of fire for just long enough. The 6th Messerschmitt broke hard right, diving away from the attack. Warner's guns tracked with it, rounds chasing the fighter as it tried to escape. He saw strikes on the tail section, saw pieces separate from the aircraft. The fighter continued its dive, trailing smoke, pilot likely dead or wounded. 7th fighter. The pilot of this one showed exceptional skill and courage. He held his course despite watching 6 of his comrades go down ahead of him. Held it long enough to fire a burst that struck Lucky Strike's wing. Then Warner's rounds found his engine. The Messerschmitt's propeller exploded into fragments. Coolant sprayed back across the windscreen. The fighter rolled onto its back and fell away. 2 fighters remained. These pilots had finally processed what was happening and were breaking off the attack, turning hard to escape the devastating fire. Warner tracked the 8th fighter through its evasion, leading it perfectly. His rounds caught it in the turn, punching through the canopy. The Messerschmitt continued its roll, no longer under control. The 9th fighter was diving away, pilot using gravity to accelerate out of the kill zone. Warner followed it down with his turret, still firing, still holding those triggers down. The range was extending rapidly. The deflection angle was extreme. By every reasonable calculation, this shot was impossible. His rounds reached out anyway, curving down through the air. He saw tracers pass close to the fighter, so close the pilot must have felt them. Then one stream of rounds connected. The Messerschmitt's left wing erupted in flame. The fighter rolled into a spin, burning all the way down. Warner released the triggers. The silence was shocking after 12 continuous seconds of firing. His turret was filled with the acrid smell of overheated metal and burned powder. The gun barrels were glowing cherry red in the dim light. Steam rose from the breech mechanisms. His ammunition counter showed he'd fired nearly 300 rounds, enough ammunition to service an entire mission, expended in one impossible burst. The intercom was chaos. Multiple voices talking over each other. Someone was praying. Someone else was laughing with the edge of hysteria. Corrigan's voice cut through the noise. "Warner, did I see 9 fighters go down?" Warner's hands were shaking now, adrenaline crash hitting hard. "Yes, sir. 9 confirmed. They're all down." There was a long pause. Warner could imagine Corrigan processing that statement, trying to reconcile it with reality. "Your gun still functional?" Warner looked at his weapons. The barrels were cooling from red to orange. The mechanisms looked intact despite the abuse. "I think so, sir, but I wouldn't want to fire them again without a complete inspection." "Copy that. We're still losing altitude. Everyone check in. I need damage reports." The crew began calling in. 2 men wounded in the waist. The tail gunner had taken shrapnel, but was still functional. Radio operator was working on getting communications back. Ball turret, operational, but guns potentially compromised. Together, they'd survived what should have been certain death. Lucky Strike continued its slow descent. Corrigan was nursing the crippled bomber westward, using every trick he knew to keep them airborne. They'd dropped to 15,000 feet, then 12,000. The French coast was still 100 miles away. Warner stayed in his turret, scanning the sky for threats. His guns might fire once more if needed, but they'd likely fail catastrophically if he pushed them. The German fighters had broken off after the devastating losses. Warner guessed they'd regroup to lick their wounds and file reports that their commanders wouldn't believe. 9 fighters down to a single ball turret gunner in 12 seconds. It would sound like fantasy, like propaganda designed to boost morale. Except the gun camera had recorded everything. The film would show the entire engagement in stark, undeniable detail. Would show Warner holding down those triggers long past the point of sanity. Would show 9 Messerschmitts falling out of the sky in rapid succession. The evidence would be impossible to dismiss. They crossed the French coast at 8,000 feet. The English Channel spread out below them, gray and cold and beautiful. Corrigan's voice on the intercom was strained but determined. "We're going to make it, boys. We're going to make it home." Lucky Strike was losing hydraulic fluid, fuel, and altitude, but she was still flying, still carrying her crew toward safety. The landing gear wouldn't extend properly. The flaps were only partially functional. Corrigan would have to bring them in hot and hope the brakes held. The English coast appeared through the haze. Warner had never seen anything more beautiful than those white cliffs. They'd made it back. Against all odds, despite a crippled aircraft and an engagement that should have killed them all, they'd made it back. Corrigan lined up on the runway, fighting the controls every foot of the way. The bomber came in fast, too fast, but there was no choice. They touched down hard. The landing gear held. Corrigan stood on the brakes. Lucky Strike finally rolled to a stop at the far end of the runway, smoke rising from the brake assemblies. Warner manually cranked his turret to the exit position and climbed out. His legs nearly gave out when he tried to stand. The ground crew was already swarming the aircraft, assessing damage, helping wounded crew members. An intelligence officer was shouting something about the gun camera, needing the film immediately. Warner walked around to look at his turret from the outside. The gun barrels were discolored, warped slightly from the heat. There were carbon deposits around the breech mechanisms. By all rights, those guns should have failed catastrophically during his 12-second burst, should have jammed or exploded, leaving him defenseless. The armorer chief approached, took one look at the guns, and whistled low. "What in the hell did you do to these weapons, Sergeant?" Warner was too tired to explain. "I fired them. They worked." The armorer shook his head. "These barrels are done, completely cooked. You're lucky they didn't blow up in your face." "Yeah," Warner said quietly. "Lucky." If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The gun camera film was developed within hours. Intelligence officers watched it multiple times, calling in senior staff to verify what they were seeing. 9 enemy fighters destroyed in 12 seconds by a single gunner. The numbers didn't make sense. The tactics didn't make sense. Everything about the engagement violated established doctrine. Yet the evidence was irrefutable. Warner was called to debriefing that evening. The room was full of officers he'd never seen before. High-ranking men with serious expressions and folders full of questions. They walked him through the engagement frame by frame. Why did he hold the triggers down? Why didn't he fire controlled bursts? How did he compensate for the extreme deflection angle? Warner answered as honestly as he could. He'd seen an opportunity, a narrow window where aggressive action might work. He'd understood that his guns could survive the heat longer than anyone believed. He'd calculated that destroying the lead fighters would break the attack formation. Everything else was instinct and training. The officers exchanged glances. One of them, a colonel with pilot's wing, leaned forward. "Sergeant Warner, what you did was reckless. It violated every principle of gunnery doctrine we teach. If those guns had failed, you'd have left your crew defenseless." Warner met his gaze. "Yes, sir, but they didn't fail, and my crew is alive." The colonel nodded slowly. "Indeed they are. Your actions likely saved that aircraft and everyone aboard. However, we can't have every gunner deciding to empty their ammunition in one burst. The doctrine exists for good reason." "I understand, sir. I'm not suggesting everyone should do what I did. I'm just explaining what happened in that specific situation." Another officer spoke up. "The Luftwaffe has already filed reports about this engagement. They're calling it a statistical impossibility. Some of their intelligence officers think we faked the gun camera." Warner almost smiled. "I imagine it does look impossible from their perspective." The debriefing lasted 3 hours. Every detail was examined, analyzed, documented. The intelligence staff wanted to understand if Warner's tactics could be replicated, or if this was a unique circumstance unlikely to occur again. The consensus eventually formed that it was the latter. The specific geometry of the attack, the condition of Lucky Strike, the discipline of the German formation, all of it had combined to create a situation where Warner's unorthodox approach worked. Try the same thing in different circumstances, and you'd likely just burn out your guns and get killed. Warner was neither court-martialed nor decorated for the engagement. The official stance seemed to be that he'd achieved remarkable results through methods that couldn't be endorsed or encouraged. His after-action report went into classified files. The gun camera footage was studied by gunnery instructors but never shown to students. Lucky Strike was repaired and returned to service. She'd complete 14 more missions before finally being retired in late 1944. Warner flew 23 more missions before completing his tour. He never again fired a 12-second burst, never needed to. The tactical situation that had made such desperate action necessary never repeated itself. Other crews began hearing rumors about the ball turret gunner who downed 9 fighters in one engagement. The story grew in the telling, acquiring details that never happened. Some versions had Warner shooting down 15 fighters. Some had him destroying an entire squadron. Warner never corrected these stories. He understood that men needed heroes, needed to believe that impossible victories were achievable. If his experience gave other gunners confidence, that was worth more than historical accuracy. The truth was documented in official records. That was enough. After the war, Warner returned to Pennsylvania and his father's machine shop. He rarely spoke about his combat experiences. When pressed, he'd acknowledge that yes, he'd been a ball turret gunner, and yes, he'd seen action over Germany. The details remained private. The German after-action reports from that March day eventually became available through captured documents. The Luftwaffe squadron that lost 9 fighters filed extensive paperwork trying to explain what happened. Their initial assumption was that they'd flown into a trap, that multiple bombers had concentrated their fire in a coordinated ambush. When reconnaissance confirmed it had been a single crippled B-17, the explanations became more creative. Some reports suggested the Americans had developed a new rapid-fire weapon system. Others proposed that multiple gunners had coordinated their fire so precisely it appeared to come from one position. The squadron commander who'd organized the attack was reassigned, not as punishment, but because high command couldn't accept that standard tactics had failed so catastrophically against a lone bomber. The truth was too demoralizing. Better to blame equipment failure or exceptional circumstances than admit that one American gunner had simply outfought 9 of their pilots. Modern analysis of the engagement has focused on the multiple factors that contributed to Warner's success. The closing speed of the attack meant the German fighters had less time to evade than usual. The staggered formation that should have been their strength became a vulnerability when the lead elements were destroyed. Warner's mechanical aptitude let him understand exactly how much abuse his guns could survive. His pattern recognition allowed him to predict where each fighter would be. His willingness to violate doctrine came from experience, showing him that doctrine sometimes got men killed. Remove any one of these factors, and the outcome would likely have been different. Warner himself acknowledged this in a rare interview conducted in the 1980s. He was asked if he considered himself a hero. His response was characteristically modest. "I was a technician who got lucky. I understood my weapons, understood the tactical situation, and made a choice that happened to work. On a different day, with different circumstances, I'd have burned out my guns and gotten killed. I'm grateful it worked out. I'm grateful my crew survived. That's all." The incident remained largely unknown outside military historical circles for decades. The gun camera footage stayed classified long after the war ended. Warner's name appeared in a few specialist publications about aerial gunnery, but without the dramatic details. It wasn't until researchers gained access to the full archives that the complete story emerged. Even then, some historians were skeptical. 9 fighters in 12 seconds seemed too perfect, too much like propaganda. The math suggested it was possible, but barely. The gun camera footage finally settled the debate when it was declassified in the 1990s. The black and white film shows exactly what Warner described. Shows the Messerschmitts entering their attack run in disciplined formation. Shows the ball turret guns opening fire and maintaining continuous fire. Shows 9 German fighters falling from the sky in rapid succession. The footage is clinical, devoid of drama. Just machinery and tactics and consequences. Warner was invited to several air museums and historical societies after the footage became public. He attended a few events, answered questions from young veterans and aviation enthusiasts. He emphasized that war was not glorious, that survival often came down to chance as much as skill, that every victory carried the weight of lives lost on both sides. One story Warner told at these events stayed with many who heard it. Several years after the war, he'd met a former Luftwaffe pilot at an aviation conference. The German had flown Messerschmitts over the Western Front, survived the war, become a commercial pilot. They'd talked for hours, comparing experiences, finding common ground in the shared trauma of aerial combat. The German pilot had asked if Warner had been the ball turret gunner involved in an engagement over Germany in March 1944. Warner confirmed he had been. The German was quiet for a moment, then said he'd known 3 of the pilots who died that day. Good men, skilled aviators. They'd been following orders, executing standard tactics, doing their duty. Warner had responded that he understood, that he'd known good men who died following orders too, that war consumed the best of both sides without regard for individual worth. They'd shared a drink to absent friends, to the men who didn't make it home, to the waste and tragedy that war represented, regardless of which side you'd served on. Warner died in 2003 at the age of 81. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his service as a ball turret gunner, but didn't detail his combat record. His family knew he'd been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and Air Medal with clusters. They knew he didn't like to talk about the war. They respected that silence. At his funeral, a group of men in their 70s and 80s appeared, former crew members of Lucky Strike who'd stayed in touch over the decades. They told stories about Warner that his family had never heard, about his calmness under fire, about the day he'd saved all their lives with a 12-second burst that should have been impossible, about how he'd never bragged about it, never sought recognition, just went back to his position and kept doing his job. The tail gunner from Lucky Strike, now in his 80s himself, gave a brief speech. He said that Warner represented the best of his generation. Men who did extraordinary things, then came home and lived ordinary lives. Men who carried memories they couldn't share but never let those memories define them. Men who understood that survival was a gift that demanded you live well, live fully, honor those who didn't make it back by building something worthwhile. The ball turret from Lucky Strike was eventually recovered and placed in a museum. The guns Warner fired that day are still there, preserved behind glass. The barrels still show the heat discoloration from those 12 seconds. A small placard explains what happened, though it can't really capture the reality of the moment. Can't convey the fear, the split-second decision, the vibration of the guns, the sight of 9 fighters falling from the sky. The museum sometimes hosts school groups, young people who know World War II only from textbooks and movies. They look at the ball turret and try to imagine climbing into that cramped space, suspended beneath a bomber at 20,000 feet, knowing enemy fighters were coming. Most can't really conceive of it. The docents tell Warner's story, tell them about the impossible 12-second burst. The kids are impressed by the numbers, 9 kills, 12 seconds. It sounds like a video game achievement. The docents try to add context, try to explain that those 9 kills meant 9 pilots who never went home, 9 families who received terrible news, that Warner understood this, carried it with him, never celebrated it. The tactical analysis of Warner's engagement has been studied in military academies as an example of adaptive decision-making under extreme pressure. The case study examines how rigid adherence to doctrine can be counterproductive in specific circumstances, how successful tactics require understanding not just the rules, but when to break them. The analysis also emphasizes that Warner's decision worked because of his specific expertise and the specific situation, that the lesson isn't to ignore doctrine, but to develop the judgment to know when circumstances demand deviation. Young officers studying the case sometimes focus on the wrong elements. They see the dramatic success and miss the context, miss that Warner had 17 previous missions of experience, miss that he understood his weapons better than almost anyone, miss that he'd calculated risks most men wouldn't even recognize existed. The instructors have to guide them toward the real lessons. Expertise enables adaptation. Experience provides context that no manual can teach. Judgment matters more than rigid rule follow. Warner's story intersects with larger questions about how we remember war and warriors. American culture often wants clean narrative, heroes and villains, glorious victories and noble sacrifice. The reality is more complex. Warner did something extraordinary. He also participated in a war that killed millions. His skill and courage saved his crew. His success meant 9 German pilots died. Both things are true simultaneously. Warner seemed to understand this complexity in ways many veterans of his generation did. He didn't reject recognition of his service, but he didn't seek glory either. He acknowledged the necessity of the war while recognizing its terrible cost. He took pride in his skill while mourning the necessity of using it. This nuanced perspective has become less common in modern discourse about military service. We've drifted toward more binary thinking. Warner's generation, the men who actually fought, seemed better at holding multiple truths at once, at being proud of their service while recognizing its tragedy. The physical toll of ball turret service isn't always appreciated by those who study aerial combat. The position was cramped to the point of torture on long missions. The cold at altitude was severe. The isolation was psychologically demanding. The vulnerability was constant. Warner spent hundreds of hours in that position, body contorted, breathing oxygen through a mask, surrounded by thin metal and plexiglass. His back and knees never fully recovered. He dealt with chronic pain for the rest of his life. Legacy of being folded into that turret mission after mission. He never complained about it. When asked about his health issues later in life, he'd note that he'd made it home when many hadn't. That seemed to be enough for him. The chronic pain was a price he'd accepted. The generation that fought World War II tended toward that kind of stoicism. Problems were endured rather than discussed. Pain was private. You dealt with it and moved forward. Modern psychological understanding recognizes costs that Warner's generation didn't have language for: post-traumatic stress, moral injury, the psychological weight of taking lives even in justified combat. Warner's mechanical aptitude, the skill that had made him such an effective gunner, served him well in civilian life. He expanded his father's machine shop, adapted it to serve the growing automotive industry, eventually employed 30 people. He was known as a fair boss and an exceptional machinist. Customers knew that work from Warner's shop would be done right. That precision and reliability he demonstrated at 20,000 feet over Germany translated directly to peacetime manufacturing. His employees knew he'd served in the war, but didn't know the details. He was private about his military service, though he'd occasionally attend reunions with his former crew. Those men shared experiences that couldn't be explained to outsiders. They'd faced death together, survived together. That bond lasted the rest of their lives. At the reunions, they'd share a few beers and remember friends who hadn't made it back. They'd talk about families and grandchildren and the quiet satisfaction of ordinary life. And sometimes, late in the evening, they'd talk about specific missions, specific moments of terror and triumph. The conversations helped process memories that couldn't easily be shared with anyone who hadn't been there. The question of whether Warner could have achieved the same results with controlled bursts remains debated among military historians. Computer simulations suggest that the answer is almost certainly no. The coordinated attack by 9 fighters, executed properly, should have destroyed Lucky Strike regardless of defensive fire. Warner's continuous burst worked because it created an unexpected wall of fire that the German formation flew into before they could adapt. Controlled bursts would have allowed the fighters to evade between firing sequences. The tactical surprise was crucial. The Luftwaffe pilots expected standard defensive fire patterns. They'd trained against those patterns. Warner gave them something completely different, something their training hadn't prepared them for. By the time they understood what was happening, half the formation was already down. The surviving pilots broke off not because they were cowards, but because continuing the attack had clearly become suicidal. Warner had turned a tactical certainty into a death trap through pure aggression and mechanical understanding. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The broader context of the air war over Europe in 1944 helps frame Warner's achievement. By March, the Allies had achieved air superiority through brutal attrition. The Luftwaffe was still dangerous, still capable, but increasingly outnumbered. German fighter pilots were younger, less experienced. Their veteran pilots, the ones who'd survived years of combat, were being overwhelmed by the sheer number of Allied aircraft. Every engagement depleted their ranks further. The loss of 9 fighters in a single encounter, especially to a crippled bomber, was significant beyond the immediate tactical impact. It represented resources Germany couldn't replace. Pilots who'd completed training, but would never gain the experience to become truly effective. Aircraft that had consumed scarce materials and manufacturing capacity. The strategic bombing campaign succeeded not through any single mission, but through accumulated losses the Luftwaffe couldn't sustain. Warner's 12-second burst was a tiny piece of that larger puzzle. One engagement among thousands, but it illustrated the shifting balance. Illustrated that American crews were becoming more skilled, more aggressive, more willing to take risks while German capabilities were degrading. The psychological impact on the surviving German pilots from that engagement isn't well documented, but it's not difficult to imagine. They'd executed a textbook attack on what appeared to be easy prey. A crippled bomber, falling out of formation, obviously damaged, the kind of target that should have resulted in a quick kill and minimal risk. Instead, they'd flown into a buzzsaw, watched their squadron mates disintegrate around them. The pilots who survived would have filed reports, but they'd also have carried memories that would make them more hesitant in future engagements, would make them wonder if that next crippled bomber might somehow be equally dangerous. That psychological edge mattered. Hesitation in aerial combat often meant the difference between success and failure. The Luftwaffe needed aggressive pilots willing to press attacks despite defensive fire. Experiences like the one Warner delivered made such aggression much harder to maintain. Fear is contagious. Stories spread through fighter squadrons. The American bombers became more menacing in the telling. The defensive fire became more dangerous. Morale eroded incrementally, engagement by engagement. Warner's gun camera footage has been analyzed frame by frame by modern ballistics experts trying to understand exactly what happened. The rate of fire, the dispersion pattern, the impact effects, all of it has been studied in detail. The consensus is that Warner achieved what's called optimal kinetic convergence. The 2 guns in his turret were synchronized perfectly. The harmonization was exact. Every round from both guns arrived in the target zone within milliseconds of each other. This created a concentration of fire that was devastating to aircraft structures. The Messerschmitts weren't just hit by a few rounds. They were hit by dense streams of heavy machine gun fire that overwhelmed their structural integrity. Modern aircraft are built to survive battle damage. World War II fighters were lighter, less robust. Multiple .50 caliber rounds striking critical areas could cause catastrophic failure. Warner's guns delivered exactly that kind of punishment 9 times in 12 seconds. The ballistics experts note that the slightest misalignment of his guns would have reduced effectiveness considerably. Warner's mechanical skill in maintaining his weapons, ensuring perfect harmonization, was as important as his shooting skill. The role of luck in Warner's survival and success can't be ignored. He was lucky that his guns didn't jam or overheat catastrophically. Lucky that none of the German fighters scored killing hits on Lucky Strike during their brief firing opportunity. Lucky that the formation geometry aligned perfectly for his defensive strategy. Lucky that his crew held together under extreme stress. Warner acknowledged this luck readily. He never claimed to be invincible or special. He knew that other equally skilled gunners had died because luck didn't favor them. Knew that survival in aerial combat was always provisional, always temporary. This awareness kept him humble, kept him from the kind of overconfidence that could get men killed. His crew trusted him completely because he never pretended to guarantee their safety. He just promised to do his job to the best of his ability and hoped that was enough. That honesty created a bond stronger than false bravado would have. They knew Warner would fight for them, knew he'd take calculated risks when necessary, knew he wouldn't waste their lives through recklessness or ego. The technical specifications of the ball turret Warner operated are worth understanding to appreciate his achievement. The Sperry ball turret was a marvel of mechanical engineering. 2 .50 caliber machine guns with 300 rounds each, hydraulic and electrical systems for rotation and elevation, a computing site that helped calculate deflection. All of it crammed into a sphere barely large enough for a man to fit inside. The gunner entered through the aircraft's fuselage, lowered himself into the turret, and pulled the hatch closed. Once inside, he was entirely dependent on the aircraft systems. If those systems failed, he was trapped. If the landing gear wouldn't deploy, he'd be crushed on landing unless the crew could manually crank the turret to allow him to exit. The psychological pressure of operating in that environment was intense. Warner managed it through focus on his job, through understanding that fear was counterproductive, through trust in his crew and his equipment, the same mental discipline that allowed him to fire continuously for 12 seconds while surrounded by enemy fighters. The comparison between Warner's achievement and other notable gunnery feats in World War II reveals how exceptional the engagement was. Other gunners achieved high kill counts over multiple missions. Some shot down 5 or more enemy aircraft during their combat tours, earning recognition as aerial aces despite not being pilots. But Warner's 9 kills in 12 seconds remains unique. No other documented case shows that kind of concentrated success in such a brief window. The closest comparable incidents involved top turret gunners who destroyed 3 or 4 fighters in a single engagement. Even those events were considered exceptional enough to warrant detailed investigation and documentation. Warner's action existed in a category by itself. The military historians who've studied the engagement most carefully describe it as a statistical outlier, an event that happened once and was unlikely ever to be repeated. The specific combination of circumstances, skill, judgment, and luck that enabled Warner's success was simply too rare to expect recurrence. The impact on Lucky Strike's crew extended far beyond that single mission. They flew together for 3 more months, completing another 15 missions before their tour ended. Every time enemy fighters approached, every time the intercom crackled with warnings, they remembered March 18th, remembered that they'd survived what should have killed them. It created a sense of borrowed time, a feeling that they'd already used up their luck and were living on grace. Surprisingly, this didn't make them more fearful. It made them more determined. They'd been given a second chance. They were going to see it through to completion. Corrigan's piloting became even more precise. The waist gunners and tail gunner coordinated their fire more effectively. The crew operated as a single organism, each man anticipating what the others needed. Warner remained their anchor. His calm presence in the ball turret, his steady voice on the intercom, reminded them that skill and discipline could overcome impossible odds. They trusted that if another crisis came, he'd find a way through it. The letters Warner wrote home during his service, preserved by his family, show a different side of the man than the official records reveal. He wrote to his parents regularly, brief notes reassuring them he was safe and well. He mentioned crew members by name, small details about daily life on the airbase. He never mentioned combat in any detail, never described the fear or the violence or the losses. His letters could have been written from summer camp rather than a bomber base in England. This was typical for his generation. The men who fought the war protected their families from its reality, compartmentalized their experiences to preserve some sense of normalcy. Warner's letters mention repairing a truck for the ground crew, learning to play poker, the terrible food in the mess hall, reading books borrowed from the base library, the routine details of military service stripped of its lethal context. Only after the war, decades later, did his family learn what those bland letters had concealed. Learn about the missions over Germany, the fighters, the desperate combat at 20,000 feet. Warner's relationship with his weapons was almost intimate in its intensity. He cleaned his guns meticulously after every mission, checked every component, made minute adjustments to ensure perfect operation. The armorer crews learned to trust his maintenance completely. They knew Warner understood those 50 caliber machine guns better than anyone else on the base. He could diagnose problems by sound, by feel, by the pattern of wear on components. This expertise saved his life repeatedly. Jams that would have left other gunners defenseless never occurred for Warner because he'd prevented them during maintenance. The overheated barrels that should have failed during his 12-second burst held together because he'd verified their metallurgical integrity, ensured proper headspace and timing, confirmed that every component was within tolerance. The relationship between craftsman and tool translated into a combat environment where failure meant death. Warner's peacetime machine shop experience had taught him that precision mattered, that careful attention to detail prevented catastrophic failures. Those lessons transferred directly to war. The question of whether Warner's action should have resulted in a Medal of Honor has been raised by some military historians. The criteria for the nation's highest decoration include risk of life above and beyond the call of duty while engaged with an enemy. Warner's 12-second burst certainly involved risk, certainly went beyond normal defensive fire, certainly engaged the enemy with devastating effect, yet he was never recommended for the award. The likely reason is bureaucratic rather than a judgment of his actions. The circumstances were complex. The violation of firing doctrine was problematic. The outcome was so unusual that officers struggled to contextualize. Easier to document the achievement, study it for lessons learned, and move on than to open the complicated discussion of whether violating orders to achieve success should be formally rewarded. Warner never expressed disappointment about this. The Distinguished Flying Cross he did receive was recognition enough. He cared more about his crew's survival than about medals. That priorities remained consistent throughout his life. The technological evolution of aerial combat moved rapidly after World War II. The ball turret became obsolete within years as jet aircraft and guided missiles transformed warfare. The intimate visual combat that Warner experienced, where you could see the enemy pilot's face as you fired, disappeared. Modern aerial combat happens at ranges measured in miles, conducted with computers and missiles and radar. In some ways, this evolution made war less personal. In others, it simply changed how that personality manifested. Warner observed these changes with professional interest. He attended some air shows in later years, marveled at the capabilities of modern aircraft, but he also noted that the fundamental challenges remained unchanged. Machines were just tools. Human judgment, human courage, human sacrifice, those still mattered. The technology changed how war was conducted, but not what it demanded of those who fought it. He'd lived through one specific moment in that long evolution, had mastered the skills required for aerial combat in 1944. That those skills were now obsolete didn't diminish their importance for the men who'd needed them. The reunions Lucky Strike's crew held every 5 years were sacred events for the men who attended. They'd gather in different cities, bring their families, spend a weekend remembering. The format was always similar. Friday evening, just the crew, no family, time to talk freely about things they couldn't discuss with outsiders. Saturday, families included, lighter conversation, stories that could be shared. Sunday, a memorial service for crew members who'd passed away. As the years advanced and the crew aged, those memorial services grew longer. By the 1990s, only 4 of the original crew were still alive. By 2000, just Warner and Corrigan remained. They met one last time in 2002, 2 old men who'd faced death together 60 years earlier. They spent the weekend talking about their families, their lives, the long journey from that war to this moment. They talked about the friends who weren't there, about missions that still haunted them, about the weight of survival when so many hadn't survived. Corrigan died 6 months later,